Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Speaking and Communicating podcast. My name is Roberta, and this week I am back with a special guest. His name is Jaekun Cho. He's actually a friend of mine, and we've been friends for years since I lived in South Korea. He is a project manager for a construction services company. And before we go any further, let me give him a chance to introduce himself. Hi, Jaekun.
Hello, thank you for inviting me on your podcast. It is a
Pleasure.
pleasure that you thought of me as one of the guests to speak on your show.
I actually specifically picked you for this reason. Today, I wanted us to discuss the cultural and communication differences between the Eastern culture and the Western culture. I know you grew up in the US, right?
Only during my childhood years, yes,
During
for
your
9
childhood.
years through
Mm-hmm.
elementary school, and I have lived in South Korea since middle school. So that would be a little less than 30 years in Korea now.
Right. And then where you work right now, and some of your previous jobs as well, I believe, you have worked with both Korean people and people from the US or other Western cultures. Is that right?
Yes, correct. For the most part, I was surrounded mostly by Korean people,
Mm-hmm.
but I did have a significant amount of experience with people from Western cultures like the United States or Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and some experience with people from Southern Asia and the Middle East.
All right. When you look just in general, based on your experience, when you look at the cultural differences, first let's talk about the communication aspect. In corporate America or in South Africa, for instance, let me talk about my experience just to give an example. When you express your ideas to your boss, even if they're different from what he thought, usually you're applauded because a win for the team is a win for the entire company and everybody makes money and you get a bigger bonus. Is that similar? Is similar situation in South Korea?
I want to say no,
Mm,
but at the same time, I must put out a disclaimer before I go any further
mm-hmm.
that before I joined my current company, I was a freelancer, or in to put it bluntly, I was unemployed for 5 years.
Right.
And I realized that the job market in Korea has changed a significant amount during that period. So I can't say I speak for all Korean companies,
Of
but
course.
I will speak from experience that I've had working for Korean corporations and even as an officer in the Korean Air Force.
Okay.
So, yes, as you have mentioned, in the West, it is not uncommon for people to expect feedback, whether it's for or against what the superiors have stipulated.
Right.
And it is considered a positive thing because, like you
Mhm.
said, a win for the team is a win for everyone. Now, unfortunately, to apply that in the corporate world in a culture that was based heavily on Confucianistic ideologies,
Right.
made it very difficult for people to accept someone who especially is a subordinate to speak up against what they have just said. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much of that is true in actual practice, but a theory of why some major catastrophes have happened in the past. For instance, a Korean Air airliner crashing into the mountainside somewhere in Guam, was
Mm-hmm.
it, a few decades ago.
Right.
It said that it was due to a lack of communication between the co-pilot and the pilot, and the reason for the lack of communication between those was the co-pilot was afraid of challenging the his superior's decision.
I heard
Which
this of the same incident in San Francisco. I don't know if you know that one, that the co-pilot was younger And as you say, the pilot was the superior. And even though he could see that he needed to do something different in order to avert the potential accident, he couldn't because of the hierarchy and the communication aspect of it.
I'm not aware about the San Francisco one,
I
but I
heard
can
of the San
imagine
Francisco
if it
one.
involved Eastern Asian people, not just Korea, but since my experience is limited to Korea,
Mhm.
I would say that yes, it would be highly possible, likely that if there were Koreans involved, that might have been the situation.
That might have been the situation. So in general, you said it is changing with this generation, or it has changed in the last few years.
Right, because first of all, before culture plays a role in any aspects of society, it's
Mhm.
mostly about survival. We all human beings, regardless of our cultural backgrounds, we do what we feel, we think, we believe is best for our survival and longevity,
That's
and eventually quality of life.
Mhm.
So to go into a little more background, after the Korean War, it's only been just a little over half a century. And as everyone knows by now, no other country in the history of the world has ever bounced back so strong as Korea did
South
in just
Korea.
half a century, from being
Mhm.
a pile of rubble after a war into being one of the world's most powerful economic nations.
That's true.
So,
Mm.
on the glamorous side, yes, we are a very highly advanced industrial country.
Mhm.
Especially now, we're even starting to sell our culture to the world. Shows on Netflix
Yes,
and
K-pop.
pop groups. Yes,
Yeah,
so it all seems like rainbows and butterflies, but the amount of effort and the just putting your head down and going with whatever you have was pretty much the norm in the working environment during that half century, because how else would people have been able to accomplish so much in such a little short amount
right.
of time,
So it
right?
has its benefits in the sense that you everybody just sells into this idea of working for the bigger whole, and you need that in order to build, you know,
Exactly. Yes. And that's
because
where the Confucianistic ideology actually shined, because
Mhm.
if all parts of the spoke were doing their own thing, then the wheel wouldn't have
You
been able
weren't
to
going
play
to
its part.
achieve what you did.
Right. But
Because
then
even
everyone
us
just
in
put their head
democracy,
down.
sorry, carry
Sorry.
on. Go ahead first.
Yeah, so because everybody just put their head down and put the greater good ahead of themselves. Now, it's not only the company, but it's also for their family,
Right.
because back then job security was very scarce. So if a new member of society, say in their early 20s, just out of college, somehow managed to find a job in a major corporation, it was unimaginable for that person to even consider leaving that job. So usually during that generation, which is only maybe one or one and a half generation ahead of mine,
Mhm.
uh, if they somehow found a job in a major corporation, then that would be their last position.
They wait
So
until retirement.
yeah, they're
Yeah.
retired in the same company they first joined right out of college.
Mhm.
But nowadays, people move around. A lot of
Yeah.
people skip around companies, don't really stay in one place long, and one of the major reasons is because of the lack of work-life balance. So I believe we're in a transition period where there's a mixture
Mhm.
of the old world and the new, and the mixture, I believe it's something that in a way is kind of, you can't really call it unhealthy, because like we mentioned, there is a benefit to having all the people being just very obedient and
And working
putting their
together.
company, yeah, putting the whole before themselves.
Right. As I was about to say on that point as well, is even democracy has its downside, because
Of course.
there just comes a time when we over the spectrum of just being selfish and everybody thinking for themselves. And then
Mhm.
at the end of the day, we don't achieve much. There's always debates. Everybody's pulling on different on different
Right.
sides. Then nothing gets accomplished. So both systems, there are pros and there are cons as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe so too. So if you try to look at one aspect of a society, then it's
Mhm.
easy to pinpoint what is bad about that society. But then if you look at it as a whole, there's definitely a reason why South Korea was able to rise from the ashes to such a
Right.
powerhouse in such a short amount of time. Now, obviously, if what everybody's been doing in this culture was inefficient or ineffective, that would not have been
It would not
achievable.
have happened. Here's how it was explained to me as well. So after the Korean War, the UN basically has two columns. You have nations that need aid and you have nations that give aid. So after the war, South Korea, first they were under the column of nations that need aid. Obviously they did.
Hmm.
And they were one of the quickest nations to move columns, meaning move from I'm a country that needs aid to the columns that they actually not give aid. And to
Right.
make that transition in apparently South Korea was one of the quickest in history to change sides, to switch sides like that. So that's a huge, huge accomplishment.
Yes, and one example of that is in my memory about a decade ago.
Hmm.
I'm Catholic, and
Mm.
I heard that the Seoul Archdiocese was actually able to cover for the aid of the entire Southeast Asian sector
Wow.
for countries that require aid. So that's how well off this society has become in
Mm.
such. So, like you said, we used to be one of those countries that needed aid,
Right.
and now we're actually able to give it.
Very commendable, extremely. Now,
Right.
walk us through the second thing that I wanted us to touch on, because it is part of communication, the respect aspect between both cultures, the East and the West.
So, yeah.
If I was raised in the Western culture and I go to work in South Korea, what are some of the things I need to be cognizant of when it comes to respect, respecting other people? What should I know? What should I remember to do? Things like that.
Hmm. Okay, that is actually a very difficult question given that we are in a transition period. So, I
Let's just talk in the last 10 years, for instance, because that's when we first met.
right. So
Yeah.
what I was trying to say is that there
Mm.
is no I can't think of any one rule at the moment. So
All
if
right.
we were to actually an easier way to approach this would be, so let's imagine we are 20 years ago
Okay.
in the yeah, so early 2000s or maybe even in the 90s.
Mm.
Then I could definitely say for sure that even if somebody says something that is wrong,
Mm.
you should do your best not to directly challenge them. And if you feel that it's something that is inevitable, you should do so in a way that you still somehow highlight how brilliant they are for having said such a thing.
Okay.
So you should never try to take someone's credit. I mean that still applies anywhere, but what I
That
mean is,
applies across the board.
of
But I
course,
think
but let me
let me
clarify.
be more specific with my question. One, in Western culture, we respect everybody despite age.
Hmm.
I have a baby brother. I'm 23 years older than him,
Hmm.
old enough to be his mother. And I remember when he was in kindergarten, I had said something that offended him. We were in the car, we were driving home. And he said, "Sis, that hurts my feelings." I said, "Oh, Pumpkin, I'm so sorry. I will never say that again. I will never hurt your feelings again. I respect the fact that that's how you feel about the situation. You will never hear me mention it like this again."
Hmm.
So that means even me being 23 years old, I respect him. But when I was in South Korea, I remember that even the lingo is different. If you talk to your peer, there's a bit of a casual tone versus speaking to someone older, even older by year, because that's the first thing they actually ask is how old are you? Once you
Yes.
introduce yourself, my name is Roberta.
Yeah.
Where are you from? I'm from South Africa. How old are you? Whereas in Western culture, especially asking a woman her age,
Mhm.
that's a no-no.
Right.
Mm.
I mean, even here, asking a woman her age is also a no-no, but
Is it?
sometimes the need to place that person on a spectrum
Mm-hmm.
needs the need to be polite.
Right.
So
That's what I mean.
if we're in
Yes.
a group and I need to get acquainted with all the people,
Mm-hmm.
without it will be difficult for me to go to bed at night, not having placed a handful of those people on a certain spectrum so that I know how to address them, what tone to use when I speak to them,
Right.
and whether or not I will be direct with them
Mm-hmm.
or just bite my tongue when I'm speaking to them.
Which I would say in Western culture, at least based on my experience, we don't go that deep into it because we just think, however I address people, no matter what age, that's how I'm going to address them. But it can differ, obviously, when I'm with my friends, I'm a different person versus when I'm in a
Mhm.
professional setting. But in a professional setting, whether older or younger, that's just, you just think this is how I'm going to address the situation or how I'm going to interact with my colleagues.
Right. But
Mm.
then, of course, wherever we are, nobody likes being told that they are wrong or being challenged by someone, right? Because everybody
Mhm.
still fears for their position and
The survival instinct
well,
again.
yeah,
Yeah.
somebody snatching up their position, so they're no longer required, their services are no longer required by the company. But
Mhm.
I will say this, like in that interaction that you have told me as an example between your younger brother,
Mhm.
whether it's a professional setting or just a private casual setting, if say in a traditionally Korean environment,
Yeah.
the older person said something that hurt the feelings of the younger person, and that younger person somehow expressed the fact that what you just said hurt my feelings,
Yes.
more often than not, the elderly, the person, the superior,
Mm.
would not apologize for their behavior, but
Mm.
go as far as to say, look, I know what I just told you may be bitter, but it's advice and I am teaching you about life.
So it's a
So you
preparation and I'm responsible for being a
yes, and
prepared provider. Uh-huh.
of course, the majority of the time when somebody resorts to that sort of excuse, it's usually BS, right? They just don't want to admit that they made a mistake and they're hiding
Yes.
behind their badge per se of age, right? So if I'm 64 and you're 63,
Mm.
everything I say is okay, and something you say doesn't, if it doesn't make me happy, then I can always call you out on it.
The I pulled the older card. Mm.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
You see this badge? I my number is one bigger than yours. So whatever I say, you should suck it up. But if I'm not happy about something you say, I will be direct about it.
It is a generational thing as well, not just a cultural thing. And I'm 46, and so I'm looking at this new generation now, and I'm thinking of when I was a kid. Was
Mhm.
that, first of all, when I was growing up, we all believed that, excuse me, we all believed that our parents knew everything. Everything they said was right. So we didn't challenge it. Nobody in my generation challenged our parents. But now these kids are very outspoken. Like I
Yeah.
said, with my baby brother, these kids are very outspoken, but I've noticed that in Western culture, that they speak up to their elderly. In
Mhm.
Korea, I found that it was still a thing in this. Let me give you another example. When you stand on the Seoul subway, you stand behind the doors waiting for the train. If you're the first one to stand behind the doors, and then everybody will come subsequently. They stand right behind you. And then when the train comes and the doors open, suddenly the older people just jump right in front. They don't join the queue. And when you watch around you, you can actually see that everybody else just lets them in. Is
Yeah.
it a, oh, older people are just like that? Or is it an actual cultural expectation?
I think it's a mixture of both
Mm.
because the older people, like we said, since South Korea has developed so much in a short span of time,
Yeah.
the older generations may find it difficult to actually get accustomed to the new way of life.
Okay.
So it could also be that they are not aware that there's a queue and that's something that's like an unspoken rule that you should abide by.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's also possible that these elderly people think that they deserve to walk outside of the boundaries of the rules because they are the
After
elder.
the sacrifices they made to live this legacy you guys are enjoying now. Yeah. They're like,
Yeah,
we've earned it. We need
of
to go
course, not all
further.
of them come from such a noble place, but it's just more of a sense of entitlement that
Yeah.
they sort of assume themselves just from the fact that they're probably older than most of the people around them.
Mm, mm.
Now, what you just said about how in the West, regardless of age, people speak up, now is actually the younger generations of today are actually becoming that.
Yeah.
So the work environment is changing drastically because I'd say up till the time when I was fresh out of college,
Mm-hmm.
it was also not easy to imagine a subordinate speaking up against their superiors. So I also grew up in a generation where the remnants of the past were still pretty much in place. So we had to just strictly obey our superiors, even when they were wrong.
Right.
But I'd say the kids in their 20s nowadays, so that's like 20 years younger than I am,
Mm, mm.
they tend to speak up a lot more. And
That's
I've heard so many stories of people more or less my age saying things like, "Oh, kids these days, they're impossible," which I
ah.
think is something that repeats itself every generation, not only in Korea, because wherever you
Mhm.
go, a new generation, they have ways that the older generations just cannot fathom. Uh, you
Yes,
know,
they always bring
you can
something
be
new to the mix. Mm-hmm.
yeah, like in the West, I think one thing that's actually is especially prevalent in visual wise is the dress code in of public figures, right?
Right.
Uh, the way people dress on television
Mm-hmm.
uh, in the past less than a century has drastically changed from uh, you know not very revealing to very revealing, if not stark naked. So yeah, so every generation has their problems with the newer generations.
Because of the differences between how they do things and how they present themselves. Speaking of dress codes, do you
Mhm.
think, based on your experience, that because I found that in Korea, appearance is everything. Do you feel that in the West we're a bit slack when it comes to how we dress up and present ourselves in a professional setting? Because I found that in Korea, everybody always looks spectacular.
Now, I wouldn't really say that that is especially true in Korea as opposed to countries of the West. I
Oh.
mean, yes, it is true that Eastern cultures are more about saving face, so people care more about how they come off rather than how
Mm-hmm.
they actually are. But I believe it's more of a collectivistic mindset. So it's not so much, I need to look my best for everyone. And of course, that is still true in many people, but I don't think that's the dominant mentality. But the
Idea.
mentality is,
Mhm.
if everybody around me is neatly dressed and I'm the only one who stands out in a
Mm,
casual tone,
mm.
I don't want that kind of attention.
Right,
So
right.
just to fit in, they're doing that.
That
So
that
with
could be the general motivation behind looking your
right.
best. Okay.
Not yeah, of course there's still that, yes, I need to look my best for everyone because I need to save face, right?
Mm,
But I don't think that is a dominant motivation for people to dress up and wear thick makeup and whatnot. They
mhm.
just don't want to be seen as a person who is behind the times. They need to they need to be with the latest fashion. Or so even in conversation, this is the reason why I believe it's not only about looks,
Okay.
because let's say we're talking about a specific drink that you can just buy off the shelf in any store, right?
Mm,
One day I was having this conversation about this vitamin drink that is pretty popular in Korea. And I said that, oh yeah, so this a pharmaceutical company that manufactured this drink, I was talking about them, and midway every single person in that group corrected me. No, actually, that was made by B Pharmaceuticals.
Right.
So just the fact that everybody automatically knows the maker of a certain product is proof that people feel they need to stick with the times.
Don't get
So,
left
so to speak,
behind.
right?
Who wants to?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
everybody's aware of everything, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you're wearing clothes that were in fashion 3 months ago and somebody tells you, hey, you're still wearing that, then that automatically becomes your
Past
weakness.
times. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now, of course, there's some exaggeration in what I just said. And now, like I said, because we're in the transition, it's not so much anymore because nowadays you see a lot of women with curlers still in their hair on the subway because
Oh,
as long as they present themselves the way they want to present themselves to the people they want to present themselves to, it doesn't
the
really
rest
matter
of
how
the
their
time
colors are.
they just who they are.
Right.
They don't
So
care. Mm-hmm.
yeah, so women on the subway in the morning doing their makeup
I've seen
on the
that.
commute.
Yes.
Yes. Obviously, they're showing a lot of random people, passersby, their
Right.
bare face.
Then I'm
But as
still
long as
getting ready.
they arrive at their destination in their full makeup, it's no big deal. So
Mission
it's not
accomplished.
so much about, yeah, it's not so much about saving face anymore.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are in Korea nowadays are also being very individualistic, which I
Yeah,
think is a pretty healthy mix at this point.
of course. Mm-hmm. So
And
what
another
can you,
thing,
sorry, carry on.
yeah, so going back to the corporate culture of not daring to challenge your boss, your
Yes.
superior, it also goes back to how people feel pressured to to deliver a certain level of achievements while they're in their position. So
Mm.
let's say someone who works for Samsung gets promoted to a member of the board.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once you become when you become a member of the board, you become a contractor. So every year they will evaluate your performance and decide whether they want to renew your contract or terminate it.
Okay.
Now, of course, if you work for Samsung, you still have that incentive. So if even if they don't renew your contract, some other company is going to want your experience from Samsung,
Right.
so they'll offer you a raise. But before we get into that, it's just that everybody wants to secure their spot as much as possible. So they want their name on a lot of achievements. So let's say I'm in this position for 5 years. The
So do
contract
you
is
think
5.
that influences why then they don't challenge? Is it back to that survival instinct? I want to do my best in my personal life through this job?
It's more about when the board member has a 5-year contract
Mm.
that the company has hired them to carry out a specific mission.
Right.
They want to make sure that their team members are people who will not waste their time. Now, of
Accomplish it.
course,
Yeah.
productive
Mm.
feedback is not a waste of time,
Yeah.
but for someone who is in a very rushed mindset, it may feel like a waste of time. So
Right.
they would preferably hire people who will just,
Go with the
so
flow
to speak,
just to
yeah,
get the mission
just
accomplished.
be
Yeah.
quiet. If I make a mistake, it's all on me.
Mm-hmm.
Don't think for yourself, just do what I tell you because we've
Right.
only got 5 years,
To
and
accomplish whatever goals we've been setting.
the
And
order
yeah.
from above for me to accomplish my mission for 5 years
Yeah.
is to come up with a product that can compete with, say, our competitors' 20 years
Mm-hmm.
of research.
So what
So
is the
let's say,
one thing, sorry to cut you, Jaken,
Mhm.
so we can wrap up. What is the one thing you can tell Westerners if they are thinking of going to work in South Korea? What's the one thing you would just like to tell them to be cognizant of in order to adapt?
Right. So going back to the point that I was trying to make earlier,
Mm,
that is actually literally an impossible question to answer simply
yeah,
in modern Korea
as you
because
said,
there's
things are changing.
such a diverse mixture of people that you never know what you're gonna get. So
Mhm.
I guess the one consistent rule that I would like to say is that just keep an open mind. Don't have any expectations. Keep an open mind, and you've got to catch on with how the culture is in whichever company or group you end up
Right.
joining. and you have to act accordingly. So you got to be a pragmatist,
Okay.
because let's say you come to Korea expecting a very hierarchical culture, and you don't speak up, and you happen to land in a group where they actually expect you to speak up. But
Right. Then
then
it works
vice versa.
against you.
Yeah, vice versa can also be true. Like you come
Mhm.
in thinking, okay, I'm a Westerner, I'm just gonna stick with my ways, and then you happen to join a very Korean group, and they hate you for the way you are, right?
So be
Uh,
adaptable, read the room, and just go with the flow of where you find yourself. Keep an open mind, like you said.
yes, and I would like to close with a an example.
Right. Let's keep it less
So
than 2 minutes.
yes, about 15
Mm,
years ago, I was able to speak with this woman from the United States
mhm,
through a group of friends, and she was complaining about Korea, how, among many things, when people bump into her on the street, they
mm.
never apologize. They never say excuse me, and they just walk away. Now
Okay.
she just could not grasp the fact that people can be so rude, right?
Mm,
And I've tried and failed to point out to her that it's a different culture, because to her, having spent the majority of her life in the United States,
yeah.
to her understanding, it was human nature to apologize to someone when you run into them.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to tell her it's not in this culture to say excuse me to anyone. It's actually a culture where saying anything to a stranger is also it's something that's very awkward. So just the fact
So they're
they
not
put their
intending
head
to
down and walk
offend.
away,
Mm.
yeah, that's actually a sign of an apology. But she's just couldn't imagine how that was true.
Not
So
saying
I would
it
like to just
verbally.
say,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
would just like to say, like, if you go to some tribes, in their culture, it is a polite thing to spit on someone's face, right? And if you express disgust over that, that is considered rude, right?
Mm.
So if
Cultures are
someone from that
different.
culture
Mm. Mm.
came to any country and imposed that culture on the people, they're going to piss off a lot of
That's
people,
a no-no. That's a
right?
definite no-no.
So you
So
got to,
adapt.
when I say you got to keep an open mind, you got to
Right.
let go of all of your beliefs on what you've learned in your in your native culture. Now,
Right.
obviously, it's still not right to kill people or harm people unnecessarily, right? So as long as you stick to those basic
Mm-hmm.
human
Mm.
rights, just let's just say, if you're from the United States, the amendments that are enforced by your
Okay, let's
legislature.
let's 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 be careful not to touch on the political side, but just um, the example you gave, just keep an open mind, read the room, understand the environment in which you work, and adapt to that. Obviously, don't let go of the personality and who you are, of your personality, who you are, but
Mhm.
actually adapt and learn to understand the
Yes.
motivation behind what they do, and not jump into conclusions or jump into being offended immediately. Because I
Right.
think that benefits you more than even the people that you have come to work with.
And you will realize that keeping an open mind will
Mm,
actually help you grow in a lot of ways you wouldn't have imagined.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Keep an open mind. Thank you so much, Jaekun Cho. It's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.